After Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence was read publicly in, across the United States. After after the first public reading in New York, the crowd turned into a mob and pulled down the statue of King George. The statue was beheaded, head stuck on a pike. That's often people who were executed, their heads were put on pikes like Cromwell. And most of the rest of the statue was melted down and made into musket balls. Now that the colonies and the young United States are fighting a war against the British, they're going to need a flag. You need a flag on the battlefield, among other places. On the battlefield, the flag helps orient you among the chaos, so you know where your guys are and you know where their guys are. This was the first flag of the 13 colonies when the war began. You can see that it's you got the Union Jack up there, the British flag in the corner, and just the red and white stripes. After this is the flag of people who aren't sure what they're fighting for, right? More than a year, they're fighting more than a year before Congress actually declares independence. But once Congress does declare independence and the United States is born, well, then Congress decides we need a new flag that looks, more American. Now, Congress specifies it's going to be 13 red and white stripes and then 13 stars on a field of blue to represent the 13 states. Congress did not specify 5 or 6 pointed stars, and nor did it specify the arrangement of the stars or whether the red or white stripes go on the outside. These are just two of the many interpretations that were going around during the war. Eventually we settled on 5 pointed stars in this arrangement with red stripes on the outside. But of course the problem is, before and after the Declaration, Americans are losing, and we're going to see that turn around today. I like this illustration because it shows us the uniforms, the best case scenario uniform of the Patriot Continental Army. It also shows that not everybody's in uniform, right? You had, there weren't enough uniforms to go around, so not everyone was properly outfitted. A lot of militia, especially, just fighting in their street clothes, although militias also had uniforms. The cocked hat, the tricorn here, becomes a symbol of the patriot cause, and guys who fought in the war rock the cocked hat, for the rest of their lives. It's a badge of pride. Here, of course, are the British redcoats, and yet, as grim as it was looking back there, with the United States consistently losing through 1777, somehow the United States pulls it out and wins the war. So our project today is to figure out how the U.S. gets it turned around, and wins the war. Key turning point is Valley Forge. Valley Forge in Pennsylvania is a place where Washington takes his army to camp. The Patriots have just suffered a major setback. The British have conquered Philadelphia, the capital, forcing the Continental Congress to flee for their lives. Congress is meeting on the road for the next several months. Meanwhile, Washington and his troops hunker down at Valley Forge to endure a brutal winter. They've got a shortage of clothes, a shortage of blankets, it's bitter cold, shortage of food, they're hungry. It would have been a successful winter if they had merely survived, but Washington has greater ambitions than that. In addition to surviving the winter at Valley Forge, they're going to stay through the spring because there is some important work that Washington wants to get done. work that's going to sow the seeds of Patriot victory in this war. First, Washington needs to beat smallpox. The war coincides with a massive outbreak of smallpox in the 13 colonies in the United States that then spreads across the continent. Now, that in itself was not a surprise. Like, anytime you go back more than 100 years, and anytime there's a war, you're bringing people together from all over the place and putting them in one place in the same army, and people are going to bring whatever diseases they that were going around in their hometowns and share them. So, throughout human history, until really the last century, in every war, disease is going to kill more people than battles. And this war was no exception. It was tougher for the Americans, though. Like the Brits, back in Europe, smallpox was endemic, meaning most people got it as kids because it was just going around. Smallpox is a one-and-done disease. Like, you get it once, and if you survive, you're not going to get it again. If you die, you're not going to get it again either, but that's small consolation as you are dead. But in Europe, because people live in towns and cities mostly, most people have had exposure to smallpox previously. So smallpox is not decimating the British the way it is the Americans. Most Americans don't live in towns and cities. Most Americans are rural, yeoman farmers. And so for a lot of them, their first exposure to smallpox comes here during the war, and it's devastating. Washington's got to get a handle on this problem because it's hurting recruitment, right? People are afraid. Congress has only given him money for a small army, but he's having trouble filling up his small army because people are afraid to join his army because they're afraid they're going to get smallpox and die, and they're right. That's a real risk. Washington needs to change that perception by changing the reality. So Washington orders his troops inoculated. This is like a primitive form of vaccination, right? Vaccination in the modern sense hadn't been invented yet, but Africans, West African civilization had developed a method of inoculation where they had noticed that if, so smallpox, like a lot of diseases, people, different people react in different ways. Some people get smallpox, they get a little bit sick, and then they get over it, and other people get really sick and get over it, and other people get really sick and die. Well, West African civilizations had noticed that if people get smallpox and they only get a little bit sick, and you take some pus out of their smallpox sores and rub it into a cut on a healthy person's arm, that person is likely to get a mild version of smallpox, which of course is protective, right? Smallpox is a disease you can only get once. So this was the African method of inoculation. How do colonists, how do Europeans learn about this? Well, they're bringing slaves over to the New World, forcing them to work on plantations. This is part of the reason, by the way, African slaves were disease resistant, because inoculation was widely practiced in Africa. And a lot of the slaves continue to inoculate their children. And, white folks notice and ask questions, and scientists notice, and they start doing experiments and studying and documenting that inoculation in fact works, that your odds of survival are 7 times greater if you expose yourself to smallpox intentionally via inoculation than if you get it the bad old way. Get it the bad old way, you're 7 times more likely to die. Now, George Washington is a man of the Enlightenment. He respects science, and he knows that getting his troops inoculated is going to mean fewer of them die. So he does. He orders them inoculated. This works. Smallpox stops decimating his forces. This helps solve his recruitment problem. People can join up knowing that they're probably not going to die of smallpox. Getting this done this winter at Valley Forge was smart because, hunkered down in Valley Forge, it's too cold to fight a war. Now it's safe to inoculate your men because, in this inoculation method, you were going to get sick. You were going to get smallpox, and you weren't going to be well enough to fight for, a couple days, maybe a week. Good to get that out of the way in the downtime at Valley Forge so that you're not at a military disadvantage. Next, Washington at Valley Forge is going to capitalize on the availability of foreign military officers. Mentioned last time that one of Washington's challenges was a shortage of effective military officers. There just weren't enough guys like Washington who had useful leadership experience from the French and Indian War. So he gets help from Europe. There's plenty of experienced officers in Europe. This Lafayette guy just shows up. He's a French nobleman, and Lafayette, here and here, show up willing to help. Washington can use the help, so he welcomes Lafayette. Lafayette there's a reason France is interested. Lafayette is basically an informal agent of France. France wants to join this war. They would love to stick it to the British. They would love to get revenge for their defeat in the French and Indian War. But they need to see that the Americans can do something. And, sending Lafayette to help train the American forces and help lead the American forces after Valley Forge is a way that they can, monitor the Continental Army and see if the Patriot cause is worth investing in. But it's not just Lafayette. There are also straight-up mercenaries, paid foreigners, like this guy, von Steuben. Von Steuben came from Prussia. Prussia was a German-speaking country, very powerful at the time, renowned for having the best army in Europe. And von Steuben was a gifted officer, but didn't have much of a future in Prussia. He was getting discriminated against because he was gay. That was illegal at the time, punishable by death, and it dimmed his promotion prospects in Prussia. So he comes over to help the Americans. Pretty soon, Washington gets reports from some of his officers. They're like, "Hey, this von Steuben guy, he's gay. We should kick him out or hang him or something." And Washington says, "No, we're not going to do that. Von Steuben is a good officer. He's good at his job. We need his help. We're trying to win this war. You need to relax and mind your own business." A couple Polish guys, Kosciuszko and Pulaski. There are cities, towns, counties across the country named for these guys. There's Steubenvilles, and Oprah Winfrey comes from Kosciuszko, Mississippi. There are Pulaski counties across the country. Kosciuszko survives the war, goes home, becomes a great war hero and freedom fighter in Poland. Pulaski dies in battle in 1779, fighting for the Americans. Kovács is the last foreign officer we're going to talk about. He was from Hungary, and he, too, like Pulaski, dies in battle fighting for the American cause. So, Washington now has a healthy, fully inoculated, and fully trained army. Those foreign officers have not just helped him train regular soldiers, they've helped him train up American officers, and now they're going to help Washington lead American forces into battle and try to earn French support, convince the French that the United States is a viable concern and worth investing in.